Francesca, thank you for joining us for this interview with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. For a quick introduction, you are the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian Territory, as well as an international lawyer and academic. In your role as UN Special Rapporteur, in June, you published a report focusing on Israel's practices when it comes to imprisoning Palestinians. Could you start by telling us what were the findings of your report about the treatment of Palestinian prisoners and the experiences they go through?
Thank you, James. First of all, I would like to say why I decided to focus on this particular topic in the context of a situation which was already very serious and alarming as it was before the 7th of October. Because arrest and detention was a phenomenon of severe, of particular gravity, which was very well documented by Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights organizations, affecting individuals and children alike. And it had been so across decades. And so it was serious in terms of numbers because around 900,000 Palestinians have been arrested and detained at least once by Israel since 1967, and also because of the level of the practices used against Palestinians in detention or in Israeli custody, which significantly violated international law. How could this be tolerated? So I decided to look at the overall phenomenon of why Israel arrests and detains Palestinians so massively, even at such a very young age as 11, 12, and how is it possible that this doesn't lead to consequences? So my main conclusion, looking at the legal structure that leads to arrest and detain Palestinians, and look at the practices, at the coercive practices that are used against Palestinians from arrest throughout the detention period and after, I concluded that arrest and detention is largely arbitrary, and in fact there is a widespread and systematic use of arrest and detention against the Palestinian people, which might amount to crimes that are prosecutable under the Rome Statute. So international crimes that lead also to individual responsibility of the concerned authorities, so the Israeli authorities. I've also looked at arrest and detention practices of Palestinian authorities to an extent. It was very difficult to access information beyond what is already public concerning arrest and detention by Hamas. Although, again, I had points of severe criticism toward the de facto authorities in Gaza. But what was more preoccupying from my perspective was the conduct of the Palestinian Authority, which to a large extent reinforces patterns of illegality of the Israeli authorities, particularly in the execution of the security arrangements, because many Palestinians are arrested and detained by the Palestinian authorities and the Israeli authorities in a sort of a cycle that the Palestinians describe as Bab Duar, the revolving door. They are arrested in a sort of continuum by the Israeli or the Palestinian, one of the two first and then the other.
In your report, you talk about how Israel uses imprisonment as a tool to repress and control Palestinians. Can you elaborate on this point?
Yes, without condoning any act of violence or any crimes that Palestinians might have committed against Israelis, particularly Israeli civilians, during 56 years of brutal and illegal occupation that has transformed, or it has turned into the vehicle to illegally confiscate Palestinian land and forcibly displace the Palestinians without justifying anything that could amount to a crime. I've looked at the let's say the legal foundations to arrest and detain Palestinians on the one hand, concluding that we are facing a mass incarceration governance, and I will elaborate on this in a minute. But also there are custodial practices that violate basic standards of international law for the humane and dignified treatment of people deprived, of individuals deprived of their liberty, particularly children. So what I mean by mass incarceration structure is I've looked, and in doing so, I've done my own analysis of military orders, but I've also relied upon the huge literature that exists, both scholarly literature and the reports produced by the UN, like the Working Group on arbitrary detention, and other human rights organizations, as I said, Palestinians, Israelis, and internationals. And I've analyzed these legal grounds, which are military orders. So the Palestinians under occupation are under a web of 2,500 military orders that regulate every minutiae of their life. Really, from education, taxation, building, taking residence, and of course, there are many grounds that lead to arrest and detention. Some grounds relate to security offenses, other grounds to violations of what would be maintenance of public order. So, looking at what leads to arrest and detention, I had to conclude that most of the military orders leading to arrest and detention are in fact sanctioning and repressing the basic exercise of fundamental freedoms. For example, think of some examples. Being part of gatherings of 10 or more people where a political issue is discussed, and can be a vigil, can be a demonstration, can be any meeting, without the authorization of the army, can lead to 10 years in jail. Detaining materials or even holding opinions that might be considered hostile, by whom? By the army, might lead to many years in jail. And so being associated to a member of an organization that the occupation forces deem hostile can lead also to 10 years in jail. Now, think that, what is hostile is virtually anything. Can be charity, can be all major political parties and hostile organizations. There are 422 hostile organizations. Some of them, including the most reputable human rights organizations in Palestine, like DCI, or Defense Children International, and Adamir, working for prisoners' rights, or Al-Haq, working for human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. All this, they're beyond hostile. They are considered terrorists. Can you believe that? So it's very difficult not to belong to an entity which is considered hostile under Israeli military law. So the system is that of a military dictatorship. There is no other way to convey what the system that leads to arrest and detention in the occupied Palestinian territory is. And let me just elaborate one further point. The military orders are written by soldiers, so not by lawmakers, over which the Palestinians have some scrutiny. So they are written by soldiers, enforced by soldiers who consider themselves in hostility with the Palestinian people, and are enforced by soldiers, adjudicated by soldiers, including in military courts, which are military tribunal. They are not presided by civilian judges. There are civilian judges, but only for Israelis, for the settlers in colonies, which shouldn't be there in the first place. So there is a legal dichotomy, a legal dualism, which is the backbone of the apartheid reigning in the occupied Palestinian territory. And of course, I should have said that there are different regimes, because in fact, this is very true, 100% for the West Bank, where of course there is also the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority has municipal autonomy at best. It's not a ruling authority over a state. There is not such a thing in practice as a Palestinian state. It's all occupied territory. And East Jerusalem is different because it's annexed. So there is the Israeli jurisdiction, so no military law. But soon after the creation of the State of Israel, Israel retained in its legal system emergency regulations and defense orders from the British mandate system. So really from the colonial era. And these 1945 legislations that are applied to the Palestinians, and frankly, the Palestinians only, including in Israel and East Jerusalem. Then for the people in Gaza, everyone says, yeah, but Gaza, there is Hamas. Of course there is Hamas, and Hamas has been the local reigning authority for 16 years, thanks to the blockade, in fact. But Israel has still enforced the occupation and the blockade through military orders. And Palestinians from Gaza have been often arrested under another piece of legislation, but which applies to them and them only.
You mentioned some of those sort of organizations which advocate for Palestinian human rights, Defense for Children International Palestine, Al-Haq. Could you speak a little bit more about the difficulties that Palestinian human rights defenders face, both as targets of Israel's arrests, but also as the lawyers and human rights advocates who are trying to document and raise the awareness of what's happening to prisoners?
Yeah, look, the challenges are many, but to give you also some anecdotes. As I was studying for this report, and I have conducted hundreds of interviews with Palestinians, but also with Palestinian and Israeli organizations and other experts on arrest and detention. And I've come across the work of the working group on arbitrary detention. And I found that, for example, someone like Shawan Jabarin, the director of Al-Haq, I mean, there were 3 or 4, if not 5 cases that the working group on arbitrary detention had looked at for Shawan Jabarin. So he's been someone fully invested in the protection of human rights, at the time where no one was talking about human rights. It was all about international humanitarian law. And then you have this organization who starts in the late 80s working on human rights. And it's one of its leaders, like Shawan Jabarin, was persecuted himself for his activities, for his human rights work. And so there is the active persecution of individuals working as human rights defenders. Think also of the case of Salah Hamouri, who's been detained on and off for a total of 17 years. And this is someone who's my age, so he spent half of his life in jail, and mostly because of his work as human rights defenders in the last part of his life. And because he was a lawyer with Adamir, and eventually he's been deported. I mean, his residency permit in Jerusalem was revoked, and he was deported to France, which is absurd. So there has been an active persecution. But if we also look at the institutions, there are 2 elements that strike to me. The first is this designation as hostile of human rights organizations or other organizations working for development, humanitarian purposes, or in social justice, being designated as hostile or even terrorist. Of course, this is something that endangers them because it puts them at risk. Human rights defenders should be protected. They enjoy special protection in international human rights system. Instead, they are targeted and they become an individual. They become individual targets, but also it's very dangerous for them to do the work they do. So the overall work of this organization is threatened. And in fact, we have seen last year the organizations who were targeted as who were designated as terrorists, the 6 organizations, they had their office raided. And they were collecting information. They were collecting evidence for an ICC investigation. So this is also a violation that might amount to an international crime of tampering with the evidence of crimes being committed. So it's very serious. And at the same time, look at what has happened. Instead of supporting these organizations, instead of continuing to support these organizations, even the international community is abandoning them to an extent, is punishing them, because there are countries like Switzerland or Germany, or I think the other one is Austria, who have cut their funds to human rights organizations in the occupied Palestinian territory and in Israel. So on top of putting conditionality on them, conditionality over conditionality, which puts a strain on them as part of a people who still are under occupation and under oppression, they are even penalized by these draconian measures, which are frankly not only inexplicable to me, but also highly immoral at the time the Palestinian people are going through that much suffering. There is also the problem, I mean, Israeli human rights organizations, many of them are facing the same draconian measures or similar draconian measures than the Palestinians, because there have been several steps taken to make these Israeli human rights organizations vulnerable, their capacity to receive funds from abroad. They have been the target of incitement by Israeli governments, challenging their Israeliness. While I think that if there is one bastion of democracy in Israel, it's precisely Israeli human rights organizations who do love their country, of course, but at the same time, they don't want it to operate as an apartheid state against the Palestinians.
Francesca, you spoke a bit about some of the organizations which are being targeted in this way. And one of them is Defence for Children International Palestine, who PSC is working closely with, along with other partners, on a campaign called No Way to Treat a Child, which highlights the impact of Israeli practices, including that of military detention, on children. Can you tell us about how Israel uses the imprisonment of children as a tool and what Palestinian children experience when they go through that process of arrest?
I would like to start by everyone understanding the context, because there is a coercive environment in the occupied Palestinian territory made of what I said, a military system that controls every aspect of Palestinian life. And it's made of physical confinement, it's made of digital surveillance, it's made of a constant oppression, including through bureaucracy. But within this system, the Palestinian children are the first and the most frail and the most frail victims. It's normal because they are children. And look also at the demography. Half of the population of the occupied Palestinian territory is made of children. 40% of the population is not even 15. And instead of being spared, they have been targeted. And arrest and detention bears testament to this. So think that the occupied Palestinian territory is also one of the rare contexts in which it's the only context in which for 56 years, military tribunals have been used to try civilians through and through, and including children. And also think that the Palestinian children are the only ones in the world who go through a military juvenile system, which is an oxymoron in and of itself. What is the military juvenile system? Where military tribunals are deemed unfit to try civilians in the first place, why they should try children. Then let's go and look at the reality again. While there might be children engaged in activities of resistance, what is armed resistance? This is so unfortunate and shouldn't happen in a normal reality. Children should not be exposed to this and should always be sheltered and protected. The majority of children are not arrested because they are involved in resistance. The majority of children are arrested, in fact, because they throw stones. And while I agree that throwing stones is not the most pleasant and peaceful act, let's take into account the reality of military tanks entering refugee camps and Palestinian villages through and through. There are 2,000 incursions every year in Palestinian towns and villages and refugee camps in the West Bank and East Jerusalem alone. So the children are arrested and detained, in very inhumane conditions. Many of them, they can be arrested everywhere, on the way to school, during an altercation with settlers or soldiers, or simply while being attacked by soldiers or settlers. They normally are arrested from their homes, in the quiet of their space, their family intimacy, in the middle of the night, by heavily armored soldiers who enter the house, destroy everything, humiliate fathers and mothers, threaten everyone, and then they take away the child in the middle of the night. The child is generally left in a military jeep, blindfolded and hand-tied for hours until 8 or 9 a.m. when the detention center or the interrogation centers opens, and then they are brutally treated, brutally interrogated. And this is heavily documented by DCI, Save the Children, Military Court Watch. And they, of course, they are interrogated without the father, without the mother, so without a parent, without a legal representative. And the interrogation can last weeks and months. There is a 16-day solitary confinement on average for Palestinian children. Imagine that there are children detained in solitary confinement for over a month just during the interrogation phase. And what's for? To have them admit that they've thrown stones or that they participated into protests. And by the way, throwing stones can lead to 10 years in jail and 20 years in jail if the stone has been thrown with intent to harm. Can you believe it? This is even possible. And then, there are reports of physical abuse. Children are held in difficult physical positions for hours. They are beaten, they are humiliated, they are threatened that violence will be committed against them or members of their family. It's very heavy to handle for a child. So whomever, and normally, like also adults, they confess crimes that they might not, offenses under the Israeli military system that they might not have even committed. And again, they do confess because this is the only way out. Because if they confess, then there will be a charge and maybe 1-2 years, and then they will be out. Now, think of a child going through all this. They come out, they are extremely traumatized. And there are organizations like YMCA, for example, who provide psychological support for rehabilitation of a child. Otherwise, it's an extremely traumatic experience. And then they go out of jail. The level of dropout from school is very high. The level of behavioral distress is very high, fully documented, and they show aggressiveness, increased neediness toward their family. It's even worse when they are under. Not worse, but it's worse in another way when they are under home arrest, because then their parents become their jailers. So these kids, again, do not have the categories to rationalize the occupation. So it's an extremely brutal experience. And because generations of Palestinians after generations have gone through this, it's an intergenerational trauma that cannot be healed so easily.
I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about the situation as it is at the moment. And over the last couple of months, we've seen the absolute horrors of Israel's bombardment of the Gaza Strip, but we've also seen a dramatic increase in violence against Palestinians elsewhere, including more arrests, more raids across the West Bank. So, could you tell us about the current situation for Palestinian prisoners at the moment?
There have been allegations of violations against Palestinian prisoners since the very beginning of the 7 October day after. So this long period has resulted into an increase of violence against Palestinians. Yeah, on top of what's happening in Gaza, which is seriously apocalyptic, and I don't use this word as hyperbolic. I really mean it. And I also sense that what we see, the little we see, is very little because there are no journalists, no international foreign journalists in Gaza, and there are 80 journalists who have been killed already. 830 people who are UN staff members as part of the 20 almost 20,000 people now. There are 1,800 people killed, 8,000 children. And again, this is apocalyptic amidst all the destruction that has been inflicted upon Gaza as a whole, as a space. And again, look at the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where there is no Hamas military operations, and still almost 300 Palestinians have been killed, including 70 children, and counting. As we speak, people keep on being killed. Thousands of people, between 3,000 and 4,000 people, have been arrested and detained, on top of the 5,200 Palestinians who were already in jail before the 7th of October, 1,300 of them without charge, without trial, because administrative detention is really widespread. And now there are thousands of people in these situations. And yes, there have been allegations of serious mistreatment, sexual abuses, severe deprivation. A number of Palestinians have been killed in detention, apparently out of torture they were subjected to. There are been videos circulated of Palestinian detainees severely humiliated even at the moment they were released. They were released naked in the middle of the West Bank. This is so humiliated. This is so inhumane. More than words can describe, in fact. And this is the situation which pushes me to ask more and more strongly for a protective presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. I will never get tired of asking the international community to deploy an international protective presence which works as an interface, as an buffer between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
What should the UK's response be to Israel's treatment of Palestinian prisoners? What are your recommendations for our government and members of parliament here in the UK?
I think that the UK needs to recover its consciousness. Its consciousness. Seriously, I can't understand. But again, I was at loss seeing where the UK as a country was going before the 7th of October, because this year has been one of the most violent in 20 years, even considering, probably without taking into account the active wars against Gaza, the 5 wars that had taken place in Gaza in the last 16 years prior to the first one. So there has been a strengthening of partnership and engagement with Israel. And again, it's so welcome to have friendship among countries, but not at the expense of international law and human rights. So they have contributed to maintain a climate of impunity, and impunity begets impunity, like violence begets violence. And also, I've seen the UK becoming such a place of obscurantism, from starting in universities where academic freedom has been seriously curtailed for political convenience, where voices in solidarity with the Palestinian people were not taken away from the rights of the Israelis, but again, the ones discriminated against and brutalized between the river and the sea, the Palestinians. And these are not my words, these are the words of Professor Alon Confino, an Israeli-Italian professor, who has said, we cannot continue to support Israel at the expense of Palestinians' rights, equality, dignity, and freedom. So the UK, instead of even considering to pass laws that further frustrate freedom of expression, like the recent draft bill to prevent the boycott of engagement with Israel at the local level, the UK should seriously stand in solidarity with international law, should abide by international law. It shouldn't apply double standards. I'm not asking to discriminate against Israel. I'm just asking the UK not to discriminate against the Palestinians, because by doing that, the UK is joining the club of states who's practicing anti-Palestinian racism. And it's becoming really thick and evident. And it reflects also with other practices of discriminating people from the global south, being them refugees or simply other countries. And this is unacceptable.
Francesca, thank you very much for your time speaking with us today.
Thank you.